to be here with the incredible Paul Bloom. It's always so wonderful to be able to talk to you in person, partly because of just the incredible relationship that you've had with Dr. David Pizarro, who is the Chief Science Officer of BEworks. And he's talked on many occasions about the way you helped shape his fascinating mind. So I'll attribute some of the sharpest thinking that he has to your shaping.
That's nice of you to say. I can't take responsibility for all of David, but I'll take responsibility for some of the good parts.
Yeah, that's one wonderful work that he's been doing on emotions, and the groundbreaking work that you've done over the years has been just so powerful for all of us, and in particular the foundational work that you did on empathy is such a way to turn that emotion, understand what's rational or what's irrational about empathy, and to really transform and I think mature our relationship with such a fundamental concept of what it means to be human. So that work has been so groundbreaking. You were able to reach into the mainstream with a book that millions of people have found accessible and changed and matured how they think about perspective taking, emotion, and even objectivity. How does that work help us understand the pandemic, and how should we be applying your insights to our own understanding and interaction with each other, with social rules around social distancing, and how our risk either fits in or doesn't fit in with this pandemic?
Wow. Okay. Thanks for this very gracious introduction. I think the short answer is that this work on empathy, as well as all of my other work, doesn't actually fit in well with helping us get through the pandemic. I'm not a medical doctor. I'm not a public health expert. I have nothing to say about masks or social distancing or whether the university should open up in the fall. We talk about this maybe, but I worry that a lot of my colleagues are also unprepared to give much of value in this situation, and they just don't know it. So I think there's a lot of psychologists putting themselves up as experts on this when we're really not in that much of a position to give firm advice on things. I think more generally, though, what I do in my work and what I did in my empathy book is I try to argue that certain sorts of emotional reactions are corrosive to morality. They don't make us better people, they make us worse people. Now, it gets complicated. There's all sorts of ways you would want to feel empathy, all sorts of ways you would want to feel rage. You would want to feel shame or guilt or bias. Some bias is just fine. I love my children a lot more than I love you, and I think that's okay. But I think that there's all sorts of cases where our emotions lead us astray, and empathy is a good example of one that does. So the way I'd connect this to this crisis and any other is that we should be very wary of arguments or claims that make us zoom in on specific individuals and take their concerns. If I wanted to argue for a much longer lockdown, I will tell you some horrible stories about people who now suffering because of the irresponsibility of governments and people open up too early. If I want to persuade you we should open up right now, I will tell you moving stories of people who've lost their businesses or livelihood. And the fact that this tool of empathy could be used to argue either side of the case just says how bad it is. The psychologist Azim Sharif and I have a paper, an op-ed we're trying to get published where we argue that under any sort of rational construal, the situation we're now in involves difficult choices. What psychologists call tragic trade-offs, where we're pitting against different choices that will cause different amounts of human suffering, and there's no way to opt out. And it's fairly we could, if on one extreme, one would open up everything, give up social distancing, opening up all businesses, and that's insane. The risks to people would just be way too high. People would die. Another extreme, we stayed locked down until a vaccine comes out and we cure every COVID's all gone. That's insane too. Could be years. No one would propose that. Businesses would collapse. There'd be people dying, deaths of despair. So we're somewhere in between. And, you know, Toronto has one policy, the United States, South Korea, Sweden, Denmark, people have different policies, and they're all navigating the in-betweenness. And I think the way to do this is through intelligent cost-benefit analysis. And that sounds really cold and really boring, but it's actually the most moral and compassionate thing to do. So that's my shtick, as to the extent there's any sort of connection.
It's helpful. First of all, I really appreciate your disclaimer at the beginning of this around kind of this staying in your lane about what your contribution is to COVID-19. And I think that the advice that you gave around, you know, some of our colleagues or the broader scientific community is probably it's very well regarded. And, you know, I think in many cases it's probably well intended. People are trying to offer whatever help or counsel or advice or point of view that they can in order to help. And sometimes it might be either intentionally or unintentionally more self-serving as a way to capture you know, people's intellectual energy to maybe, you know, garner some kind of you know, additional you know, compensation, be it recognition or financial otherwise, as a potential expert in that space. And I hope that that's fewer and far between than people's desire to try and be helpful, or maybe just not recognizing kind of where the boundaries of their expertise, you know, are more firmly planted than in other cases.
Yeah, I think that's a generous attitude. I think it's right. I know tons of my friends and my colleagues who are rushing to publish COVID-related things, and the cynical view says, "Wow, they're going to pump up their CV during this crisis." I don't think the cynical view is right. I think these friends of mine, I know their work, I know what they're up to, and they believe honestly that they can help, and they want to get their voices, and they believe they have things of value to say, and they are sincere and they are not cynical. As to whether they really do have much to say, I don't know. There's a big article just got published in Nature Human Behavior. I won't name the authors. They're very famous people. They're very famous psychologists. Kat Sunstein is an author. I'm sure people you work with are authors. And this article makes recommendations which in my mind are, for the most part, entirely true because they're incredibly banal. And they say we are influenced by the reason and by the emotions, psychologists find. We look towards others for guidance. When making a decision, we should bring in many perspectives. No harm done, but I don't really see this as I think to the extent that psychologists will say that will shock you, that will be genuine views, we should be very suspicious of them because they may not be right. They may not. You and I have talked before about the replication crisis, and this really rears its head in this case, where if we're going to give people advice that will affect public health messaging, affect how people act in this incredibly critical, important time, we better be sure what we're saying. And for the most part, we're not that sure.
Yeah, I think that the other challenge that we have is even when scientists don't know how to play in their own lane and, you know, respect the boundary of what they know and what they don't know, again, for various motivations. The same goes on the layperson side. It's an incredibly dangerous time for the distribution and firm conviction of information that people don't have the ability to process, nor should they be proselytizing it with the level of vengeance.
Yes.
Again, just using the kind of the tragic trade-off scenario that you used, we have laypersons that are you know, firmly finding their slots between, you know, position A and position B. And that's just very countervailing to what reason would dictate. So I'd love to have your thoughts on that.
It's a good question. It's an interesting issue. Lay people like me aren't to be blamed for being unsure and confused about a lot of this. I'm old enough to remember, because I'm more than 3 months old, that at the beginning of this, Vox had an explainer, which had explained things. That's what they do. They explain things, and they had a Q&A. Said, is this a global pandemic? No, it is not. Do not fall for panic. Do not overreact. I'm old enough to remember when people were really excited about the idea of wearing masks. Then went on a period where in social media was giving studies which say masks actually make things worse. Now we're back to masks. The world, according to experts, is we are either just on our way out of this crisis, we'll be fine next few months, we'll just fade away, or it's going to hit us in the fall and kill us all. So it is reasonable, I think, under these circumstances, for somebody like me to say, I don't know. But I think to get to your point, though, what people often do is they take these views and they imbue them with certainty. I've seen people say, you think masks are good, you're crazy. You're crazy. I know masks are terrible. I've read this study. You're a monster for suggesting masks. And often the same people 3 weeks later are saying, everybody should wear a mask. You don't wear a mask. What kind of heartless creep are you? And so I think a scientific attitude towards the world, one of the things it gives us is humility and uncertainty. What do I think about masks? Well, there seems to be growing consensus masks are useful. Maybe they are, maybe they aren't. I think I'll wear them because I don't want people yelling at me, And if, so I don't know. I don't know what's going to happen. And that's, I think, when people talk about a scientific attitude, that's so much of it. Not being certain when certainty isn't warranted.
I think that this aspect of scientific thinking is one of the most profound and yet most difficult to understand and perhaps even to practice on an ongoing basis. And that's usually we're equating that's what science says, with our expectation that means it's certainty, it's objective truth, we're good to go. And yet it's actually the opposite of that. And it's that paradox that evidence and science seem to suggest full issue resolution. And yet actually scientific thinking is about embracing this, there's always some scenario where we could be wrong. It's very difficult.
And it's very difficult, particularly in a case where the issue meshes with politics, because politics is a game of certainty. This person's terrible, should be thrown out of office. This person's great. If I am, like just every academic I know, extremely critical of Donald Trump. I hope he's no longer president, everything like that. And it sets up a very adversarial attitude. He and his fans have their own adversary. And that's how cultural battles work.
That's right. I wanted to pick up on something that you talked about in terms of the role of individuals in terms of being able to use that as a persuasion tool. If you want to, increase people's commitment or compliance with lockdowns, then you show people of, a range of age or other demographic characteristics to tweak their sensibility around that. Or the inverse, you need people to be ready, willing, and able to accept easing of those restrictions.
Yes.
And we've seen the impact of that in different domains. I would be interested in your point of view in terms of the ethics of persuasion and the intentional use of these fundamental insights about human belief and behavior.
Well, that's really interesting. I think, in some sense, the problem doesn't. You can imagine a problem coming up in a very serious way. If we psychologists were wizards at persuasion, we get people to do whatever we want. We know the secrets of the human mind. We know exactly the buttons to push. It's very far from the truth. I think marketers and politicians are actually much better at knowing the tools of persuasions than university professors, people and think tanks and so on. What psychologists are often good at doing is testing different alternatives, thinking about different alternatives and testing them. But some sorts of persuasion are better than others. And it raises the moral question of what kind of persuasion is legitimate and what kind of persuasion is illegitimate.
I think that the issue is incredibly complex, given that as much as we want to always be able to appeal to reason, we know that people have bounded rationality, driven by such, not saying that people are incapable of reason, which is ridiculously insulting, but rather just acknowledges that people are incredibly busy, have to make trade-offs in their time, and how much energy they will invest in learning about, the virology of aerosolization of COVID-19 particles and what level of dosage, is actually infectious, given this velocity of ventilation in a room, or can and should our public health, communicators leverage what we know about helping people, nudging people to making a quicker decision, if that imagery, things like imagery of an individual, maybe targeted population, if we know that imagery potentially has a ability to be persuasive and convincing for their safety and for the safety of others, it's not circumventing the appeal to reason to get away with something, rather just making very complex information that is very difficult to keep up with. It changes even when we think we've learned something, the rules change again. And so why not use what psychologists such as yourself, through decades now of research, have learned about what will quickly influence behavior?
Well, so two things. One thing is, certainly what you're describing is better than an alternative, which is simple coercion. I'd rather people persuade me to do something than stick a gun in my face or tell me if I don't do it, I'm going to go to prison. So the state has various powers, and I think I have a libertarian streak and think that they should kind of, that the power of violence should be a last resort. And what you said makes sense, but there's a premise in there which is an important one, which is, and of course, they're thoughtful experts with my best interests in mind. I believe in public health policy. I believe in non-smoking signs, and non-smoking signs and non-smoking environment do not have to give a 10-part argument with citations as to why smoking is bad for you. It could be some picture saying, oh, smoking is disgusting. No cool people smoke, whatever. It could try to bypass. There are a lot of cases where the state or corporations will try to persuade us to do stuff, which isn't in our best interest, because their interests differ from ours. So it's one thing if the state is trying to say, look, here's a way to be safe. It's another thing if the state is trying to say, here's why immigrants are terrible and why you should try to expel them from your nation. And then when we see, when the motives are nefarious, then we see, oh, I wish they weren't trying to persuade me and my citizens and fellow citizens in this kind of clever way. So to some extent, my cynicism about these means of persuasion is grounded in somewhat of a lack of trust in the government for the most part.
I should disclose I've never described mine as a libertarian streak. I am a libertarian, but I definitely find aspects of that political and economic orientation more challenged right now. But at the same time, I see more bolstered. Social action, philanthropy, generosity, people saying, I don't understand the science, but if wearing a mask will help others, then I'm going to wear a mask and I'm going to sew 25 more to donate.
Streak is actually totally compatible with a belief in the people's generosity and altruism. I've always believed that a lot of morality is kind of bred in the bone. And in fact, if you didn't have that streak, libertarianism from a practical point of view becomes a lot less tenable. If people are just absolutely terrible to each other, you might need more of a curtailment of individual freedoms. But, I said I have a libertarian streak. I'm not a libertarian. I'm also sometimes a utilitarian, but not entirely. Sometimes I think that a really smart person trying to figure out what's really the best way to deal with this crisis in a way that all sorts of other values would end up with a view that could not be called libertarian or socialist or capitalist, but just blends them in interesting ways.
I think that is very interesting.
And it's interesting. I kind of think that it's not that us scientists or psychologists have that much to offer in this time, but we have a hell of a lot to learn. I think this tells us a lot about a lot of different things. About now, the kind of optimal political system, the best political system, efficient and also moral, is something which we could learn a lot about. It wouldn't surprise me if some of the ways we're doing things now will stick once this is over.
So what are some of those things that you're thinking about right now?
Well, we talked about some of them. A lot of regulations that halfway thought were kind of stupid have been, the government said, okay, don't follow them anymore. They're getting in the way. And I think that they will stay. I think maybe in some states you won't go to prison anymore if you cut hair without a license. I think it might actually cause among some people who are sort of more hardcore capitalists a bit more of an understanding of how our fates are intertwined. And public health is an example of, even if you're the most selfish person in the world, you still don't want everybody around you to get sick because there's no way to protect yourself from getting sick. Things like that. Those are some things we can learn. Then there's a lot of things we just don't know about. I know a couple of people who've been staying home a lot, obviously. They're sort of locked in, and there's a bit of, is this going to cause an outbreak of agoraphobia? When this is over, will people who won't be able to leave their house? What will it do to people who were suffering from borderline hand-washing obsessions and cleanliness obsessions? Will it just ramp it up? Will it increase anxiety disorder? Will it have paradoxical effects? I do know this guy, more than one person actually, who said, always quietly, this is the best time of their lives. I know kids who feel that way. I know, because maybe school is awful for terms of bullying and tormenting, and they're free from that. Maybe people like to be alone. Maybe people like, it's sort of a privilege to be able to, because, most people have to work. I know a guy who said that in his whole life he's been anxious, and now he's not anxious anymore because the worst has happened. Anyway, we don't know. We don't know whether we're going to be happier when this comes out, sadder. We just don't know. I'll give you just a concrete example, which is that a lot of people are saying that that they're pointing to other disasters like Hurricane Katrina and 9/11 and earthquake, and say this brings a community together. The London Blitz. This is the best time of my life. And they say this is going to happen now. And maybe they're right, but this is unusual because we aren't together. We're sitting at home talking on Zoom. Will that substitute? We're not meeting on the streets and pulling people out of rubble. Rather, we're sitting in front of our computers and tipping the delivery guy a little bit extra. No, maybe not. Yeah,
the psychology of disasters is a very interesting subject, and the long-term effects of potentially speak well to people.
Yes.
Learning that communities can be built, individual relationships can be strengthened, and that there's a lot of opportunity to see the best in individuals without relying on any official infrastructure or official bodies to come together to help. There's that surge of individuals coming together to lift the rubble off of victims, and so that's a very positive potential outcome.
Yes. But how much rubble have you lifted? I haven't done it. Been home. So
to draw a parallel, I think it's an interesting question. I think that there are some thought experiments in here. So, first of all, do you see yourself as the kind of person who, in those kinds of physical, rubble type events, are you the kind of person who would lift the rubble off? And then what is the parallel here? So I think that there can be some parallels, like, did you start sewing? Did you lean into the research to the best of your ability and try to dissuade people from misinformation? Did you jump in to help people realize that Bill Gates has a very different history than an evil entrepreneur who somehow did you try to lean in on helping people understand where public health hasn't stepped in? Like, are those sort of equivalents to why else am I, creating the masks or doing the grocery shopping or these other kinds of things?
I think it's that's a great list. I think some things that people do are genuinely altruistic and connect them. I'm in a apartment building on the corner of Queen and Portland, and somebody on Facebook recently said, "Look, if there's anybody who needs help picking up groceries, I'll do it. I'll just go get your groceries, bring them to your building." And other people chimed in. I thought that's great. But then participating in the public discourse, doing the best research you can, jumping in on social media, that's more complicated, right? Because is that purely altruistic, or is that designed to get me more followers and more respect and more admiration? And so it's not, and it might be that the stuff that feeds the soul, it's the stuff that you could tell yourself, this is nice, this is good, this is for somebody else. And if you're not sure yourself, maybe it doesn't have the benefits. We talked before, neither one of us, we both want to have a positive view about psychologists who are publishing articles in this time. And I think they have a positive view of themselves, but they must wonder. They must be sitting, with their friend, or not sitting with their friends, but they must be turned to their spouse and saying, is what I'm doing kind of sleazy? Even if it isn't, they must wonder.
Yeah, it is interesting. I definitely want to maintain an optimistic view that people are just looking for, their way to lift the rubble, and maybe they'll do a meta study on all the COVID-19 publications that came out in psychology research in the future, and were they trying to lift the rubble, or was it just to pad the CV?
It's very hard to tell looking at the articles. Most psychologists, like most people, I was going to say mostly aren't very good at their job, but people differ in how good they are at the job. The most best intentioned people might produce terrible articles and do terrible work, doesn't help anybody. Well, the most cynical, cruel, self-serving people might do actually kind of good work. The people who win the Nobel Prizes in a scientific field are not necessarily the nicest ones.
Yeah, so there's quality of contribution, and then there's this issue of
there's motivation,
intent, and I think that's one of the things that we're sort of poking at, is this issue of intent.
Yes.
But if we maintain our and apply our generally optimistic view about human nature, then we might want to assume that most people are going into this with degrees of altruism, and it's like, here's the thing I know something about, I should be looking at and studying natural experiments in through this, or what else do I know about, let's say, emotions and how that could help or hurt things like public health interventions?
Yes. But I have to say, this goes back to what we were saying before. I think a lot of this work that's being done, the research work where people are trying to run experiments, is, I wouldn't say of poor quality, but it isn't of the sort that should be taken that seriously from public health. For instance, there's a lot of people who are doing studies where, say, they'll send you different messages. They'll send 1/3 of the people a message saying, you should wear a mask to protect yourself. And another third, they'll say, you should wear a mask to help your family. And another third, you should wear a mask to save the world. And then they find out which one's more effective. But because they can't judge actual effectiveness, we're all on lockdown. What they test is when people say, oh, I think I would then wear a mask more, people's intention. The problem is we know from a zillion years of psychology that what people say they'll do isn't the same as what they'll do. And we also know that in situations like this, people like to look good. So I don't think there's anything wrong with these studies. They could provide suggestions, you could do it, but it really is, we got a result using these methods. Go ahead, public health officials, frame your message in that way.
That's right. That's why we spend so much time designing behavioroids and other forms of measurement of behavior that let us actually capture and understand what's real. Everything from, in this example might be, asking people to, send pictures of their masks and talk about how, or ask them, or you might load in other questions about what are some of the challenges of mask wearing, and not to prime them, but to look at things like, how long do you wear a mask before it hurts behind your ears? You load in those kinds of questions. And what they do is they help serve as, sometimes they're not perfect, but you're looking for proxies for that real behavior. And that's the most, I think one of the things that I have the most fun working through is how we can come up with those proxies for real behavior, or actually designing experiments where we can, watch people as they walk outside or go to the store.
I agree. I think there's a lot of room for those sort of imaginative experiments that bring you a lot closer to what you're looking at. I've heard of some really clever work where they use people's iPhones. So your iPhone monitors how much you walk. And so you get access to the iPhone in some way, you ask for permission, and then you could see, well, is this message making somebody spend less time mixing with other people, and so on? Yeah, and there's been some lovely big data studies. The studies of Scandinavian countries looking at, well, the finding I understand is that to a surprising degree, whether or not a place has specific lockdown rules or not, has less of an effect than you might think. As a libertarian, you may enjoy this, which is that at a certain point, people stop going out. You see this in restaurant reservations, but also just in the iPhone data, people stop going out, even if their society or country didn't have an absolute rule about communing with people. And that's really cool.
It's very cool. And that's when techniques that help people to understand the underlying reasons for a public health recommendation, helping them understand those underlying reasons can lead to that better behavior. Yeah. Though there's the question, is that the best way to persuade people? Now we've gotten back to that issue. Yes, but that's where we can layer our interventions. And so I love the work that the philosophers and ethicists have been developing around, there's a total aversion to any form of nudging or persuasion or other forms of choice architecture. And instead there's an advocacy of, there's another term, boost, which is, we can appeal to reason by making it easy to help people process the information correctly. You don't need to use the graphic, image of a single victim. Instead, you can make the statistics nice, clear, and easy to process. Is that a term you made up, boost?
Is that what they call it?
No, the term is boost. I didn't.
That's a great term.
Yeah, yeah. And so what's been interesting for my work is looking at helping our clients understand, depending on the nature of the decision, which type is more appropriate for the kind of behavior that you're trying to do, trying to influence and direct. And there's times when the risk to the individual are higher. And so in that case, what are the mechanisms that we can use to facilitate, it's good teaching or good coaching or good decision aid design. And that's what you need to do. And, the outcome is stalled until they've gone through that journey in order to, demonstrate that they understand the trade-offs enough to now engage. This would be, for instance, projects that we've done in healthcare, where individuals need to make commitments to medical procedures or other forms of medical interventions that are potentially life-changing, either in the case of death versus life, or even in cases where it's, you can take this path of medical intervention and it's a path of no return, or you can take this path of medical intervention and it's a path of no return. Both will affect your health, but have different risks and pros and cons. That's an area where boost can be very, very useful. But then there's points when, and so I call it, this one would be my term, which is a cascade of interventions. So it's, first you try the appeal to reason-based approach and making that information easier, cut through the sludge, as Thaler and Sunstein would like to say, in order to facilitate that decision. But then as the person feels, again, a lack of security in the ability to make that decision, or other barriers such as procrastination, wishful thinking, like, oh, I don't want to make this decision, but it's like time is ticking and you must make a decision, or you will die, for instance. This is where you start to escalate the persuasion style interventions.
Yeah. And another dimension of this, and this comes from a lot of philosophy of science, which is that deference to experts isn't necessarily irrational.
That's right.
I could, it could be a perfectly reasonable thing for me to do when deciding what refrigerator to buy, to go to Consumer Reports or Wirecutter. And not do the research myself, not because I don't care about the data, but because I'm willing to trust other people to crunch through the data. Now, this comes back to certain circumstances. It isn't irrational for me to go to my local refrigerator store and say, what do you think the best refrigerator is? Because they'll sell me the one they want to sell me. It's not the best thing to do to ask, a politician who you should vote for. And to the extent you think scientists are politically motivated, or motivated by self-serving biases, then they lose their status as experts. But if you can trust, if it's rational to trust them, then that act of trusting could be as full of reason, in fact, more full of reason, doing the work yourself. I think it's much smarter for me to take the advice of a doctor I could really trust and work things out by going on Google. I just don't have the expertise.
Yeah. I think that gets us back to some of the complexities that we have in COVID-19 and the challenge of scientific thinking, because it's not always easy to know who a valid expert is. Even though experts themselves have this challenge of staying in their lane and not realizing the domain specificity that scientific knowledge is, unfortunately, but reasonably encumbered by.
Yeah. And what people do in this case, because there's always somewhat of a diversity of views, is they often shop around for the expert who says what they want to hear. If you're the kind of person who likes hearing we're all going to die, I have some experts for you, credentialed PhD experts. If you want to be reassured, I got experts for that too. I mean, my memory of this was actually the Clinton-Trump election, where the polling was heavily in favor of Clinton, but I knew people really did not want Trump to win. And they were so happy to find somebody who said the odds of Trump winning are 1 in a million. They say, look, I got my expert. But of course, it's the wrong way to do things.
Yeah, one of the things that I found so fascinating was research on climate change receptivity, and it certainly in some ways, like, the issue is very it's still very unresolved in my mind. It has to be. I don't understand climate science at all, so. I don't understand the data. I don't understand the statistics. I don't understand, how it's gathered, let alone the quality of that information. But there are so many experts that are saying that this is a very material issue. And so there's definitely a period where I would say, I've had ebbs and flows in my degrees of confusion about it. But one of the things that was incredibly impactful was that talked about the relationship between ideological belief and our willingness to perceive a problem that there's really good evidence to substantiate if we disagree with the means to get there. And so, for instance, if we believe that the required path to help solve that problem is something that is against our ideology, like heavy government intervention, and you've got someone with a libertarian streak, then you're less likely to actually accept the underlying issue. And I found that so powerful because I wish I knew the name of the researchers, because it was one of those articles that had a very profound impact on helping me, at least a modicum of debiasing in my own thinking. Was it's like, am I disagreeing with this issue and not seeing the issue because I don't have a path to solve? But part 2 of their paper was on finding common ground, basically, which is we can collaborate on, let's take your means and mechanisms to solving it, our means and mechanisms to solving it, and now let's see if we can actually reconcile a more objective interpretation or assessment of the issue in the first place.
Again, which I'm going to mangle, but it's something to the extent of, never expect a man to believe something if his job requires that he does not believe it. Nobody goes, and if the doctor says you're fine, you don't need an operation, nobody gets a second opinion. You get a second opinion when the doctor says something you don't like. And if these recommendations are grounded in a scientifically made assumption of the way the world is, you're going to be prone to reject that way the world is. And if there's enough experts to shop around, you'll find somebody who says the opposite. When my kids were young, my wife and I had a bunch of child raising books, and if we didn't like what one of them said, we looked for the opposite advice in another. And and because old advice is kind of good, it doesn't matter. But for climate change, it does matter. And I'm exactly the same as you. I believe climate change is a serious problem. Maybe perhaps the most serious problem our society has to face. And you asked me, so tell me about it. How's it all work? I said, I don't know. But I believe the people, I think there's good reason to believe that the experts who tell me to worry. And that's weird. It's a weird cognitive state to be in. And in fact, that's the cognitive state of COVID, where months ago, I'm fine, everybody knows fine, and people say, hide in your room. And say, what do you mean? And it does say something interesting that people did it, that people locked down, even though there were no immediate signs of danger to themselves.
Yes. And it's funny, we now see the post hoc rationalization around people looking at, for instance, the hospitals in California didn't have the overuse and crowding issues. And it's like, well, it's because they were the earliest on the social distancing guidelines, earliest on implementing the quarantining, but people don't recognize that causal relationship.
You do see this bizarre reasoning fallacy, which is we engage in lockdown to avoid terrible things that happening. And people say, well, nothing bad happened. Lockdown was stupid. It's I don't know. It's like somebody who has a fire alarm and the alarm goes off and they stop the fire, and later look back and say, I didn't need that stupid alarm. No fires.
It's such a great analogy.
Yes, and you see this. You see an actual case study. I think is it Sweden that had not much official lockdown policy,
Okay.
and I know some people were very eager, either for all the Swedes to die, which would justify all the shit we're going through, or for them to be fine, which would suggest that lockdown was unnecessary. And your priors shape how you want it to turn out. And of course, the data is messy enough that there was enough for a while for people to read into whatever they wanted to. There will be a million dissertations written on what we're talking about here.
Yes, there will be. And I think one of the, as we think about behavior, what have been some of the habits that you've developed over the last number of weeks, the good ones and the bad ones? And what do you hope stays with you once we're able to kind of return to normal? And which ones do you hope don't stick with you?
I have, my bad ones are overwhelming. My fiance would tell you that when we go outside, I'm bumping into people and putting my hand in my face and everything. I seem to find it very difficult to turn what I know to be safe behavior into instinct. My routines are messy. My sleep patterns have turned to is awful, and I have no excuse. I mean, we're here. We have a nice apartment. My kids are all grown up and in different places. So somebody who has 4 kids and a job requiring 10 hours a day work, I understand that they'd be freaking out, but I should be doing better. However, I will tell you one habit which has maintained, which is we're cooking. I'm not going to restaurants every third night. We buy food. We cook it. We have real meals, and I'd like that to stay. Better routines for cleaning, stuff like that. More.
Yeah.
I think a lot of. I'm curious how you're going to answer the question too, but I think a lot of cosmopolitans just spend all their time going to restaurants and don't stay much in the house. And I've moved to sort of an older style of life where the house is sort of a center for food and for work and so on. What about you?
I think that my bad habits probably outweigh my good habits.
Okay, I feel I disclosed too much about what terrible habits are. So go on. What kind of bad habits?
Yeah. Well, let's see. It's been so complicated as well. So first of all, there's the challenge of anxiety. So anxiety about my company, anxiety about the individuals on my team, consumes just this tremendous amount of emotional energy that leaves me feeling as if I'd run a marathon when it's only been a very short period of time. A half a day of maybe dealing with some issues and having to make some decisions about policies for my company, and I'm just wiped out. And I think that the good thing about that is I'm probably far more attuned to my emotional capacity than I've ever been. I've always been, I'm a workhorse, just go, drive, decision, action, move on, and grind out, very long days and very little sleep. And I've been doing that for decades.
Yeah.
And now I feel like everything has just been put into this intense, thick, molasses almost, all of it. And so it's incredibly draining. And in many ways insurmountable. And so I feel that that sensitivity to those emotions and being respectful of their requirements has been good. So I sleep now. I was the kind of person who, 3, 4, 5 hours a night, and I would wake up, ready to run, charge through the day, have a social night, and, power down for a few hours and then reboot. I don't have, the full level of optimism and great news and, everything's amazing to give me that nuclear power. And so I'm experiencing life in a very different way. And I hope that I'm able to carry that sensitivity on, and help me to potentially understand, some of my favorite things have been, for the people that are, writing books, learning 5 languages, exercising, doing yoga, meditation,
Yeah.
more power to you. But for others of you who, are excited because you managed to get out of bed, rock on with your productivity as well. Like let's all ease up on holding each other accountable for these like ridiculous levels of productivity. I think that my sensitivity and respect for the fact that we're all in a different place has been significantly altered and heightened for good. And so I want to take that negativity and bring it forward as something positive.
I won't take it personally if you tell me it's expanded your empathy in different situations.
Well, I prefer the term perspective taking.
So do I. But that's nice. Yeah. I feel the same. I've gone through periods where I've actually been quite productive in this, working on a new book, doing a lot of writing, a lot of working, doing yoga in the morning and all that stuff, going for runs. But I've also gone through periods in the last couple of months where I said, I can't do anything today. I did something which I have never done before in my adult life, which is I bought myself an Oculus Quest, which is a 3D video thing. I do this and I shoot aliens for hours at a time. They're so much fun. They're so much fun.
Yeah. So this thing about habits, and in particular, you said cooking and cleaning. So there's so many interesting things there in terms of natural experiments. So how much will cooking at home last? And another question I have is related to a project that we're working on, which is food waste. How good of a job are you guys doing in terms of like what does the rubbish bin look like for you guys? Is that a consideration for you, first of all?
This is constantly overflowing, and it hasn't been a consideration. I just noticed since you asked, maybe one too many Amazon packages too, which is, but I think in general, in part because there's also just 2 of us here, we're a bit more mindful about cooking a meal and making leftovers and so on, more efficient. I see this as what somebody is like if they live in a prairie or something, or like they're a character in a 1930s movie. But just less schmutz, less chaos, more control over things. The title of my next book, the New York Times bestseller. Less schmutz, more life. So
it's the follow-up to Marie Kondo's book, right?
That's right. What's her book called? I don't know.
Less is more.
Yeah, something like that. Yeah, I just say we just throw out the schmutz, nothing else. But I don't know. I gotta say I miss restaurants. What do you miss the most?
I miss being with my social group, which is burners, so people who go to Burning Man.
You go to Burning Man?
Yes.
Oh, I have friends who go. I've never been.
Oh, it's amazing. I talked Bob Cialdini into going because I said it was the world's largest experiment. So I'm hoping that between books and projects, he has a chance to come, because he's not even that far from where the festival takes place or the event takes place. And there's the thing about Burning Man is in some ways it's as much a lifestyle as it is just a event in the desert once a year. So there's a very active community of, burners that have events all the time. And it's actually been how I've maintained some social connection through the pandemic. Is this group has virtual dance parties, and they're a blast. And
that sounds great.
It's absolutely wonderful. And, the DJs still play, and we're still able to support the DJs. The artists and the performers each take their turn, and we still get to dance and, wear costumes and have a lot of fun.
That sounds wonderful.
It's absolutely wonderful. And
sounds wonderful.
Yeah, and I wonder if something like that, and I'm happy to invite you.
I'd love it. I'd love it. I'm a terrible dancer, but I think what's one advantage of Zoom, which is I can just go like this, and you'll think I'm dancing.
Well, I mean, the other thing about this community is it's radically accepting, and there's very judgment. So no one will notice if you're a good or bad dancer, because that's a valence that's just not a part of the community. So one thing that comes to mind when I think of a Burning Man, but maybe you don't want to discuss this in a Zoom video to be broadly available, is use of hallucinogens and other drugs. Yeah. What would you like to talk about?
is that part of the lifestyle that you continue when outside Burning Man?
Yeah, lots of people do. I personally am a borderline straight edge. I drink wine, so my daughter says I'm not fully straight edge, but it's it's kind of funny that I am as square as I am, but I certainly know it's definitely a part of the community. I know many scientists that do research on psychedelics and creativity, and psychedelics, meditation, and creativity. There's the thing about Burning Man is there are many scientists and academics who participate in the event and do things like give lectures and share their research at Burning Man. But there's also people who, use recreational drugs to enhance or play some other role in their experience of Burning Man. And so if that's something that you're interested in, that's definitely there. There's a group that is dedicated to maintaining a census of the Burning Man community that looks at socioeconomic factors of the participants, but the census, the long form version, also looks at things like people's experiences with drugs, but also sexuality, and lots of other really interesting questions get explored at Burning Man. So the Burning Man census shares that there's around, I believe the number is somewhere around 15 to 20% of the population that engages in the use of recreational drugs as a way to enhance or augment their experience. And then there's lots of people like me that are super curious to learn about what that means and how that changes and impacts people's experience, and contributes to an area of research that I did on transformation at Burning Man. I ran a field experiment there, and Behavioral Scientist Journal published the research that I did there, and I was very interested in studying the role that this event plays in transforming people's lives and understanding in which way it did. And in particular,
so interesting.
Yeah, I had fun. It was a very simple study, and I was just interested in does the event play a role in shaping people's receptivity to accepting selfish offers.
Do you know my friend Molly Crockett?
Oh yeah. Molly and I go way back.
Okay. So she does that work, and I have another friend who I'm teaching a course with next in the spring, Lori Paul, who wrote a book called Transformative Experience.
Oh, cool! I don't know Lori.
Lori is one of the most interesting people. You guys would get along very well.
Oh, I'd love to meet her, and I'd love to check out her work. Yeah, I did this Burning Man project maybe 7 or 8 years ago, and finally had a chance to write it up. This just a few months ago. I think it was in the fall that it got published.
Really? Tell me the journal again.
It's behavioral scientist.
Oh, great. Great, great. I've seen that journal. That's great. That's great.
So I have a question for you. It's actually around scientific thinking. I think I understand a little bit of the lineage of scientific thinking in our mutual friend David Pizarro, in that his mother did early research with Jean Piaget on childhood
Oh, you
development.
told me that once. Yes.
Yeah, it's so fascinating because even and so the questions that, amongst the many things that he was researching, it was looking at understanding how children understand the world, and even some elements of, what are the scientific um, thinking principles that children already have. And I understand from a book that I'm reading right now. Sorry, I'll grab it. I'm not probably supposed to do this kind of thing, but I'm reading this wonderful book called Pseudoscience right
Oh,
now. And there's a reference in here to Jean Piaget, learning about, kind of the process of scientific thinking, or the elements of it, from
yeah.
Einstein.
Huh.
So from a conversation with Einstein in 1928 to Jean Piaget to David Pizarro's mom to David Pizarro, led to this degrees of separation on kind of this journey of like, what actually is this philosophy of science? What actually is scientific thinking? So I have the same question for you, which is, what inspired you? What inspired your research? What inspired you to be a scientific thinker?
Well, that's interesting. Well, I was through most of my life an indifferent student, and I ended up in psychology, as one does when doesn't know what they want to do, at McGill as an undergraduate. And my brother is severely autistic, and I ended up working in a series of camps and daycares with autistic kids and mentally disabled kids and so on. And I figured I'd become some sort of clinician as part of the honors program at McGill. And I was supposed to find an advisor to work with, and I went to all the clinical psychologists, but because I just left it way too late, they had no slots left for me, and I needed to find an advisor. And I stumbled into the office of this guy, John McNamara, who I never heard of before, and I just was randomly going through all the professors. And it was one of these chance things which just transformed my life. So very much not a scientific view, which is he was a philosopher, true and true, caught up in philosophical views. He was fascinated with Piaget. And in fact, he had me as an undergraduate work on a project exploring Piagetian ideas of categories and how categories were formed in the child. That a rose is a type of flower, a dog is a kind of animal, and getting kids getting sorted on that. And it was transformative. So I could have flipped a coin as to whether to go to philosophy or psychology, but I ended up going to cognitive science at MIT. And there, my advisor was Susan Carey, who was tremendously a brilliant cognitive developmentalist. But I also met with Steve Pinker and wrote papers with him. And Steve was a really big influence on my life. Steve was in some way he's a wonderful scientist, but also a wonderful public intellectual. So I don't say this about many people, but to a large extent, I self-consciously model a lot of my work and my career after his. Also at MIT was Noam Chomsky, and I took classes with Noam and saw that perspective. So despite being at MIT, my background was never sort of purely scientific. It often veers into the humanistic. I'm not frightened in the idea of doing work, writing a book, writing a paper for something that doesn't sort of follow a linear scientific line. But there's parts of the spirit of science which are central to me. I like, I hate bullshit. I hate obscurity for the sense of obscurity. If I read something and I feel the author is just not making any effort and just purposely trying to impress me, I'll throw it down. I like clarity of thought. And, a lot of people were talking about, well, certainly Steve Pinker is a very clear writer and a deep thinker. But I think part of the scientific spirit is fundamentally democratic, where I will have my hypotheses, here's my idea, here's my theory, And it's not a mysterious cult. There's no rules to get in. If it should be made accessible, and any intelligent person can pick it up and run with it, and criticize it and explore it. And that distinguishes science from religion. It distinguishes science from a lot of the humanities I'm less fond of. And it's not just science. There's all sorts of humanistic endeavors that are marked by clarity and intelligence and a spirit of open inquiry. But science is at its pinnacle.
Oh, that's absolutely wonderful. Well, I think that probably makes as good as any a place to close off.
Thank you for your time. This was tons of fun.
Yeah, thank you so much.